Hello, literary lovers, and welcome to 21 Conversations, the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. I am Paula Pierce, one of the board members of Greensboro Literary Organization. Greensboro Bound is so excited to present to you these 21 conversations, our effort to create something unique and special for our community within the confines of our continued virtual environment. 21 Conversations pays homage to North Carolina's rich literary history while broadening our tent to welcome in voices from outside our own microcosm of experience. This featured presentation is but a taste of the 52 authors that we have gathered together in a series of delightful, sometimes unexpected, but always edifying conversations. Since our inception, Greensboro Bound has been committed to providing programs like the one you are about to watch, 100% free to our community. In order to do that, we need the financial support, both big and small, of readers just like you. Please support Greensboro Bound by giving now. The text to give phone number, as well as our website, are on your screen. A sustaining gift of just $15 a month or the cost of a single children's book will help us remain financially solvent throughout the year. I also want to take a moment to thank our sustaining supporters, without whom Greensboro Bound would not be possible. Our utmost gratitude to the Edward M. Armfield Senior Foundation, the Rooflands Memorial Fund, and Arts Greensboro for their continued belief in our vision to bring together readers and writers of all genres, ages, ethnicities, identities, and voices to foster an understanding of writing, a process that allows free expression, deepens critical thought, and helps sustain a culture of inquiry and delight that is open to all. Thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Greensboro Bound Literary Festival. Please enjoy the conversation.
Hi there, I'm Steve Mitchell. I'm co-owner of Scuppernong Books, and I'll be talking today with Ginger Gaffney and James Tate Hill about their books and about memoirs in general. I'm going to give you just a little bit of, I'm going to tell you about Ginger's book and James's book, and then we will let them speak. So give me just a sec. Here we go. And this is just a little, very short synopsis, but believe me, you want to read both of these books. I should tell you now that Ginger's book is available currently in paperback, and James's book is available for pre-order. It's going to be published on August 3rd, but that doesn't mean you can't pre-order it right now from your favorite indie bookstore. Ginger Gaffney's Broke is a riveting memoir that follows her, a professional horse trainer's year-long odyssey to train a herd of neglected horses at an alternative prison ranch in New Mexico. Working with her is a small team of ranch residents, men and women who are uniquely broken by addiction and incarceration. She forms a bond with them as profound as the kinship and trust the residents discover among the troubled horses. That's Ginger Gaffney's Half Broke. At 16, James Tate Hill was diagnosed with a condition that left him legally blind. Hill used his remaining blurry peripheral vision to pretend he could still see. Feigning eye contact, memorizing common roots, filling shelves with paperbacks he read via tape cassettes, he organized his life around passing for the sighted. For 15 years, Hill hid his blindness from friends, colleagues, and lovers, even convincing himself that if he stared long enough, things would come into focus. James Tate Hill's book is called Blind Man's Bluff. And reminder again, Ginger's book is available now in paperback. James's book is available for pre-order on August 3rd. So welcome, Ginger and James, JT. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Steve. And
oscillating back between JT and James. Sorry about that.
Both are fun. And great to meet you virtually, Ginger.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you both.
And Ginger, we should say you're in New Mexico,
I am.
right? Okay. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, I realize that there are two ways of actually focusing questions in a book about memoir. And one of them is to focus on your life and the story you're telling. And one of them is to focus on writing memoir and how that actually works and worked for you. So I'm probably going to be oscillating back between those two kinds of questions. One of the things that struck me in reading your books is that they both arise out of a sense of isolation within your own life. And I'm wondering about that movement from isolation and not necessarily talking about certain things to writing a memoir, and how that happens, and sort of how you got your head around that, and how you knew it was the right time to write your particular book. Many questions involved there, but choose wherever you want to start.
I can start. So first off, that we both should give a shout out to W.W. Norton, because both our books are with W.W. Norton. And one of the answers to one of those questions would be, like, my editor at Norton really wanted the book, but he was afraid that I wouldn't be able to go like public, like here you've written it, but can you actually go around and talk, Ginger? So that was a big question he had before, we signed. And so I hadn't really even considered that question, because I am and still am pretty introverted. But, I had to sort of search, and I really took his question to heart, and I was like, am I going to be able to be a public person? I am a public person in my job, what I do, but I don't do groups, and things like public speaking are very hard. So I had to really search on that. And so I wrote the book out of just passion. I didn't write the book to get published. I wrote it to sheer passion of wanting to remember everything that went down at the ranch, so that I wouldn't forget it. Because part of being isolated is you don't really value your own experiences as much as some people would, maybe. And I have a real tendency in that direction. So I wrote the book so I would never forget. And then it became a public thing, and magazines were picking up stories, and I started getting a little bit more public with it. So I don't know. I think it was the process of writing and then having interest in the book brought me out of my own closet about whether I was going to be able to be here. And one of the best things that's happened is that it's all gone virtual, so I don't have to do big groups.
Right,
But,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would not call myself an introvert, but I feel very introverted in front of groups, and part of that is due to not being able to gauge people's faces and reactions, and knowing the temperature of the room. And so I'm good with small groups of people, but I feel some of that same terror, Ginger, with being around people, certainly large groups. And with me, my own story involved for so many years hiding my blindness, and the fewer people who I knew and interacted with, the better. And even in front of like classrooms of students, I would do everything I can to never make that an issue, or even a parent. And so when I published the novel with a university press, I sort of started writing Academy Gothic with a blind protagonist, and I kind of just assumed finally that it was just interesting to me for the very first time, you know, in graduate school. One of my friends said, "Why don't you write about your blindness?" I was like, that sounds even worse than anything else I've ever written. It sounds worse than the meandering plot of this weird amnesia novel that I'm not going to finish. And so I started writing the novel, just assuming, like the previous novels I'd written, that nobody was going to read it except for my immediate friends anyway. So what the hell? Let's just put myself on the page, you know. And it's not strictly myself, but it is in far more ways. And then that was what led me the sort of book tour of that, when and doing some online writing to promote that book, where it felt a lot like coming out of the closet must feel, I imagine, where even people who knew me online for years and you know, like, wow, I didn't even know. I was like, yeah, that was the point. That was the charade. And I always, as I say in the memoir, I always felt so grateful. I always felt so gratified and proud of myself when I had fooled someone, as though that were the goal. But you know, I started realizing that was only part of the story. That was sort of the surface story. And then diving in to the memoir was definitely something that felt necessary and right, and felt like I was finally tapping into my own voice and my own story.
Thank you. So Ginger, I hear what you're saying about wanting to remember and writing to document, to witness these events that you were a part of. How did you decide that it had ended, that there was a stopping point at which to begin the process? Because I assume that is part of it. You realize that there is a more or less a completed story there.
Yeah. I started it, you know, in my MFA program here at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I was in the poetry cohort, and I was, you know, doing my homework at 5 a.m. every day, trying to write my poems. And these stories just flew out of me. And so I changed to nonfiction and went with it. You know, I didn't go to the MFA to write this book, but I think partly when you're at the Institute of American Indian Arts, it's 80% Native students, and, like, you know, really it was more like 10% non-Native students when I was there. And it's just an incredible atmosphere to write in, because of the level of quiet, which suits me pretty well. It's a very quiet community. Nobody's rushing to get the most attention from the instructor, and nobody's trying to be like the ultra best writer, and kind of arrogance is not in the room. And what's in the room is vulnerability.
Okay.
And so I got to write. And so I think being in that environment and listening to stories, all of a sudden my stories just started coming. And so I couldn't really deny them. And I didn't have a sense of where it was going to end, the book, until about halfway maybe through. And I thought, I don't want to write a book. It's just me. I didn't want to write a book more than 250 pages. I'm just that kind of reader, that kind of writer. And so I sort of had that, you know, and I was already up to 200 and wondering, you know, and I'm not one of these who writes 400 pages and has to slash back to 250. I just don't do that. So I remembered an incident that happened at about 1.5 years when we took a horse to an event, a rescue. We rescued a horse, and I brought him over to the ranch, and we trained the horse. And I thought, well, that would be a really good book ending, you know, and it happened about the 1.5 year point. So that's kind of how it started and how it's structured towards the end. But I'm a naturalist. Like I work outside, so everything about my writing is it's not super crafty. Even though I went and got my MFA, I kind of try to. I really don't lean in that direction. So I was really trying to stay true, not just to the story, but to me. You know. Yeah.
Well, I think your work is very crafty. It's just very quiet. And so I don't think you should. I just want to push back against that just a little bit because you know, you don't have to use long words and have intricate sentences that fill pages. And I think the beauty of what you do lies in the simplicity of it that overlays a lot of layers. So so I think you're very crafty.
I will concur. I yeah, I adored your book, Ginger, and loved how seamlessly it moved forward and back in time. It almost, I teach creative nonfiction, and one of the things I try to communicate is it's not all about chronology. You're also capturing an emotional arc, and I definitely felt that current of an emotional arc even as we were plunging backward in time. And I was going to ask, apropos of where you were talking, and also I sort of highlighted a couple of lines, lots of lines that I love, but a few that might be good for this conversation. And where you talked for the first time in the book about your childhood and how I think you were 6 before you were able to speak much and verbalize with words. And you referred to how silence kept you protected, and language felt like knives. And I just wondered how, if there was a transition in time where eventually, as you pointed out, and this is definitely true for me, where you find power in the vulnerability on the page. And of course, writing is completely different from speaking because the audience is really imaginary. But how did you come to finding writing to be a way to what's the word I'm looking for? Writing to become the sort of antidote to silence.
Yeah, and writing rather than speaking.
Yeah.
You know, because words, the spoken word was the knife. You know, like the way. It's just been so interesting reading your book too. Just the way language for you was like vision. You get pictures from language, and
Right.
and for me, language did not match up to what I saw. You know, like what was in front of me and what was being said was just in conflict with each other so often, and still is to a large degree. And that's kind of why large groups are hard for me.
Yeah.
So there's just too much dissonance between those two things for me still. But I think like I'll have to give it, like go back. I went to school in Greensboro. I went to Guilford College. And I was a freshman in John Stoneburner's religious class, Religion 1 or whatever it was. And we read Black Elk Speaks. It was one of the first books he made us read. And I can tell you that was the first book that ever like meant anything to me. You know, all the books I read through high school, you know, all of a sudden language woke up in an environment where people like John and the people in the room were actually like, I don't know, listening for the first time and reading language for the first time that hit me in the middle of my body. That's what I mean by naturalist. So I think I just hadn't found it yet. And then at Guilford, there was an environment, and I went to Guilford on a basketball scholarship. I wasn't like an intellectual. And but I became an intellectual at Guilford College, you know, that they woke me up to language and reading, and just the whole experience at Guilford then woke me up entirely up. You know.
JT, would you talk just a minute about your own experience with vulnerability and writing and the tension between those things on the page for you?
Yeah. You know, and just to go directly from what you were just talking about, Ginger, is writing. For me, my career trajectory began, you know, I I was sort of in a lazy B average in high school, and somehow thought that could translate into medical school because, why not? All my friends were aiming in that path, and then the vision loss, and I thought, well, we'll scale that back to physical therapy, which is less vision dependent, not knowing at the time that there are blind doctors in the world. But I think a big part of my decision making was, what can I do that I can not be, caught out or called out or seen as blind. And so, my decisions, life decisions, career decisions, friendships, relationships, all kowtowed to that particular, all those energies going toward trying to pass for sighted. That was priority number one, and everything else was a distant second. And so I got to college and I thought, well, I don't really want to do physical therapy. How about psychology? I could just listen to people's problems. That sounds like something I can do. And then but at the same time, as I talk about in the audiobooks chapter in the book, where I, out of virtue of no longer being able to play video games or watch TV in an active way, became listening to TV. I made the transition to books on tape, just almost by accident. The Library for the Blind from the Library of Congress's National Library Service meant the world to me, where suddenly I had access to these. It's so trite to say that books are an escape and take you to other worlds, but my world had shrunken beyond recognition. And now I had access to Jack London and all these movies that I had seen. Now I was reading the books. I was reading Deliverance and Jaws and pretty much anything I could think of that had once been a book before it was a movie. That was all I knew how to check out from the library, because I really hadn't been much of a reader. And suddenly I was. And then, midway through college, to circle back to your actual question of how did writing and vulnerability eventually merge, it was a long journey. I had already gotten my master's in creative writing and an MFA in creative writing from UNC Greensboro. And it was still, another decade after that before I even thought about writing about my blindness in fiction, let alone nonfiction, because for me, writing was another way that I could put a different self on the page. I could hide myself behind. I could hide behind the page. I could hide myself in other characters. So and not surprisingly, everything I was writing had a superficiality to it. There was craft there. There were characters and plots, and everything I learned in graduate school and through reading voraciously, I was able to translate into fiction. But there was also a hollowness there, I think an emotional hollowness, because I wasn't tapping into my truest self. And I think my novel was a comedy, but I think there are, some moments of honesty there. But definitely what I learned in realizing, or what I realized in writing nonfiction, was that you really aren't writing until you're fully naked on the page.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you approach making yourself naked on the page?
Go for it, Ginger.
Well, I think, I was struck by how much you allowed James, just kept coming and coming and coming with all your inadequacies, like all your honest, even when Meredith was, quite the unlikable character, you made yourself almost as unlikable at times, and I think that's the important part, is to throw yourself, not just everybody, but throw yourself under the bus too.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's real life,
Yeah.
you have those thoughts about people, and you want to not just create characters of other people, but create your character that's true to life and all your own vulnerabilities. So you have to be super willing to sit by yourself and cry through some pages, and hopefully have a partner that will support you after you've really laid yourself out there.
Yeah.
I have that, and thank God I do. I couldn't have written the book, but for me, it's one sentence at a time, and then revision is the place where you can really look for places that you can throw yourself under the bus.
Yeah.
So to make yourself really vulnerable, and make sure you're not like some kind of star of the story, because you're not. You're just one of all the people who are not perfect. And see, in my book, there's so many people who are striving to be better and better. And I remember when I was with them feeling how less of a person I felt than they were, because they were trying so much harder to be a better human being than I was. And they made me try harder. And so I tried to put that in the book about how I was feeling about myself during that process. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally comes through. And yeah, I when I teach undergrads creative nonfiction, it's such a different experience from teaching my adult students from like online workshops that I teach, because I still refuse to stop teaching creative nonfiction to my introductory creative writing students, because I think they're going to tap into things that are going to be really important to them. But one of the pieces of advice I try to give my undergrads, and I kind of mean it as a joke, but kind of not really, is try and think like a 40-something-year-old. Because one of the quickest lessons I learned the first time I taught personal essays was trying to tap into nostalgia. And what are you guys nostalgic for about like your childhood? And then I realized, oh wait, they're still kids. They don't really have that thick nostalgia, which, as we know, is that a Greek word. It's some kind of word that means a wound that hasn't healed. And as much as they do have that material, it's hard to embrace that space, that looking back voice, and that honestly that objectivity about yourself and your flaws when you're a younger writer. But one of the things I tell them that seems to make sense is writing a memoir, writing creative nonfiction is like a selfie where you usually look bad. And
That's good for them. Yeah.
And that seems to make sense, where you're not trying to make yourself look sweet. You're not selling yourself. This isn't a carefully constructed dating profile. It's actually quite the opposite.
That's perfect. I think that probably goes a long way.
I hope.
But are you creating yourself as a character there? And if you are, how do you form that character that is yourself in the context of what you're writing?
Great question. Yeah. And I think for me, it was so much easier, or maybe I don't know that I could have written nonfiction if I hadn't written the novel with a blind protagonist first.
Okay.
As different as they are. And I, seeing myself from the outside in with the memoir, with Blind Man's Bluff, I'm definitely, it helps when you start changing names of people who might not like how they come across. I mean, I stand behind the portrayal of everybody, myself included, because I do hope that I come across as deeply flawed, and as hopefully more so than anybody else on the page. But you start, one of the things that helped me see myself with that objectivity was the novel, where for the first time I was acknowledging the absurdity and the comic potential of the lengths that I went to hide my blindness, and just how an example like wearing sunglasses and never acknowledging people I passed on the sidewalks during college. And people just, to quote one friend I made senior year who had been in my freshman orientation group, she had been waving to me and didn't know I couldn't see her. And I never verbally greeted anybody because I didn't know who I was greeting. And so she goes, "Wow, I just thought you were an asshole." And I was so proud that she thought I was an asshole instead of blind. I was like, because how terrible that would be to be blind. Yeah. I'd rather be an asshole.
Yeah. And in terms of memoir and making yourself a character, I really think for me, you have to, it doesn't come easy. Like, I think you have to push on your revision. You have to look for every place you put yourself on the page and fill in the stuff that you weren't really willing to write the first and second and third time. And that's
Yeah.
that's how it went for me. And I had, you know, my editor Norton, but my partner Glenda and a few other readers and one of my great instructors, Pam Houston, just pushing on me. Everywhere you see yourself on the page, give me a little more, you know, go somewhere you haven't gone yet. So I think it's easier. It's easier to create characters of the people in our lives, harder to create ourselves as a character, but we can, and we have the skills. It just doesn't necessarily come in the first few drafts for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
so-
definitely kept plumbing new depths, and with each draft, especially once I reached the place where I had an agent who was really good at finding a few key things that were either not coming through or things that were coming through in ways I hadn't intended, and other things that, you know, my editor's notes at Norton. Amy Cherry was my editor. Shout out to her. I don't know who you were. Who did you work with, Ginger?
Hold on. It's just, I'll come back to me on that because I know him. I just lost his name though.
It's okay. But like
Tom Mayer.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I told Amy because I was clarifying a detail earlier this week and told her I had this conversation, and she was so excited about the double Norton twin bill and said how much she loved your book too. But the comments from my editor again just helped me plumb new depths, and you know, you do find yourself. I've never been one of those sort of spiritual writers who are trying to, in grand acting tradition, tap into sense memory. But I'll be honest with you, I reached this place in the late drafts where I knew I needed, you know, a little bit more material to close the gaps of what wasn't coming across, and I you know, was conjuring memories that I wouldn't say they were repressed or buried, but they were things I hadn't thought of in a long time. And it really makes you realize how resilient memory can be, but also how tricky memory can be.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that trickiness of memory, right? Because you're writing memoirs, which theoretically are, you know, track along actual events, but you're basing your writing on what you remember. And how do you work with that? Does memory get deeper as you go along? Like you seem to be intimating, James, that, you know, eventually you could kind of tap into things that you didn't know you remembered. Is writing a memoir a process of going deeper and deeper into memory, or is it a process of kind of filling in gaps with things that might have probably did happen, but we're not quite sure?
I will say yes and yes. Yeah, and I just came across this quotation from somebody, I think somebody famous, but I'm terrible with these quotations, speaking of memory, but a line from a writer a week or two ago. It said, the more times you revisit a memory, the further away from it you get. And that's because the more times it becomes crystallized in your mind as you remember it, it's probably taking a shape that's quite different from what actually happened. Not necessarily the essence of the memory, but little details. You know, your mind, especially me, where so much of my visual world is imagined. People's faces, oftentimes I conjure with personality, and how much their voice reminds me of somebody else that I knew or had seen from a TV show in 1973 or something. And there is definitely a lot of gap filling just to create the essence. But I think you have to distinguish between the liberties you take for the sake of narrative versus truth liberties. I don't think anybody would want to invent facts unless you're changing details. I shouldn't say anybody would want to, but definitely not a goal of mine. I stand behind the accuracy, but it's also based on my recollection, as the prefatory note cleared by legal states. And you might change names of people, or you might change composite details, or merge a few characters for the sake of the narrative. But it's definitely, there are a few details where and my mom hasn't read this book, but she's read pieces of it that have been published in essays. And for example, a doctor who I remembered most vividly because she reminded me so much of B. Arthur and Dorothy from the Golden Girls in my mind. And my mom was like, she did, didn't she? And then I told her a name, and she goes, no, that wasn't her first name. And then she looked it up, and in fact, I had misremembered the doctor's first name, which is neither here nor there because I changed her name anyway. But she remembered her hair color being different from me, and my eyes were still okay at that point. And it's memory is a funny thing, but you do hope that a writer is for the details that matter most, the details that are quote unquote facts or quote unquote truth, that you're not inventing or guessing incorrectly.
I know it's a big issue in the publishing world about, truth and memoir and blah, 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 blah is what I say.
Actually, I'm less interested in that than I am in just your own personal connection to memory and how that connects.
Yeah, well, in terms of quotes, Lydia Yuknevich, the wonderful writer, she's like says it a lot in her workshops that every time it's known scientifically that every time you remember an incident, it changes. So then you remember it a lot of times as a writer, and how many times has it changed, from the original source of your memory, and what part of that is true and what's not true about which part of all those different memories of the same memory. And it's kind of liberating to hear that, for a memoir nonfiction writer, because then you can just let those things that are happening to you, James, where they felt almost like they were coming out of nowhere, all these memories.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have something called a conscious memory. Like I can remember events, mm-hmm. But then there are these unconscious memories that as a writer happen, where you're writing along and it starts to flood you, all these memories. And that's coming from that place that writers, when we're writing really well, that's where we're writing from. And so I think sometimes like memory it's not literal. It's not interesting when it's just conscious memory. Like I could have told all those stories from a conscious memory, but I told it from some place that came through me, not out of just what I really remember.
Yeah.
And checking in with my people at the ranch, when I finally was able to share some of the book with them, I didn't want to share it too soon, but I was able, and it's, they were like, wow, you really captured us, I don't think I captured them just from my conscious memory. I think I captured the whole emotional memory, all the other ways memory comes through. It has to come in this mysterious kind of way, I think.
Yeah. Memoirs are not collections of facts, right?
Yeah.
They're a unique perspective on something going on, whatever people choose to be writing about, and that's what makes them interesting, and that's what makes them something you want to read, because it's outside of your own experience. I was thinking, as you were speaking, Ginger, that one of the things I loved about your book was just the sheer physicality of it, and the way that you write about physicality, and the way that I learn about who people are first by how they carry themselves and how they walk and how they essentially enter a scene. So your book is really focused on this particular kind of sense memory. Sense memory may not be the right phrase for that, but memory, that images that I feel, sensually. And James, your book, it works like that, except around sound, right? And so you're concentrating on an aspect of experience that I don't necessarily draw out from everything that I'm experiencing in a given moment. So both of your books concentrate on very specific kinds of senses. And James, it's obvious kind of why yours is that way, but I wondered if you wanted to talk about trying to write, both of you, from those particular sensory, or from those kinds of sensations.
Yeah, and that's something that again, I got some practice with the novel to do, where it was sort of the blind character in Academy Gothic was an amateur detective, a business teacher at a failing college, and I got the chance to sort of use sound as a narrative device, and what he couldn't see was part of what helped reveal the story and solve the mystery, because it was a murder mystery as well. And I sort of had to learn how to undo so many, while writing the memoir. I realized even in later drafts how I had to undo so many of my instincts, where for many years before the novel, before Academy Gothic, all the novels I had written, of course, didn't feature anybody with blindness. And so I was sort of trying to write from the same 5 perfectly functioning senses that I had until I was 16. And so I realized I was inserting visual details on the page in the memoir that really weren't accurate. And it wasn't because I was trying to paint a picture. It was because it was my instinct still to pretend I could see. Like, for example, going to a low vision clinic and getting visual aids for the first time from a doctor who I always imagined in my head as looking like Molly Ringwald's bookish sister. And then I realized in later draft, she didn't look like that. I don't know what she looked like. That was just who I pictured. And so I had to sort of go back through and realize there were these places where I was saying this looked like this, but no, that's what I imagined it to look like. And sometimes I built those images in my mind from sound or from perception or from previous experiences. But yeah, that was definitely where I had to learn how to foreground, learn how to own the fact that I live with my ears much more reliably than my eyes.
Yeah, that was remarkable. Reading the book was remarkable. I was enjoying it thoroughly, noticing that every step you were telling the story from the perspective of hearing, and it was so interesting, for me, given that my whole thing is really more about movement and seeing, that I was just
and touch too.
And touch. You get lots of the senses: hearing, sensing, smelling. But a really remarkable book, because as writers, we're supposed to use like all our senses, right? We keep hearing, use all your senses, and like you have to just stay with your senses so directly. And it has to be honest, like you're saying, you don't know what that person really looked like. You have to edit out what you really don't know. And when I was going through writing the chapters in my book, I was more to what did you see, Ginger? What did you hear, Ginger? Not like what was the story, but what did you see? What did you hear? What if you can't remember exactly, what would you have thought? What would you have seen? Because I do this stuff with horses every day of my life. I'm incredibly kinesthetic. The way people move and the horses. And so I had to keep going back to those senses while I was writing. I just I just stuck it, as they say in basketball. I just stuck it. And I try not to leave the space that I work in every day. I tried not to leave it when I was writing. I try not to go up here. I just stay in my body, stay where I really live. And that was easy for me. Once I got that writing technique down, I could write for days from that perspective.
And so you did this. So I've never been around horses. I mean, more than just casually passing. And I mean, the writing and the experiences that you convey with these horses is if anybody watching this is a horse person, you're not going to see or read about exactly what you've experienced before. These wounded animals, it's just completely remarkable and gripping, these almost feral horses, because they're so damaged and wounded, and at the same time capable of empathy through healing. And I mean, it occurred to me as you were talking that that was why I found so much solace in books, audiobooks, but to me they were just books, but everything that you captured with words to communicate what you saw and what you experienced and everything that was unfolding to a reader, blind reader, deaf reader, any kind of reader. It's the same story. It's the same words. It's the same images. And so that to me was just a natural transition, that suddenly books were to me what they were to somebody else, even if I was reading them with my ears, because the language and the picture and the story was just as vivid to me, because the author is doing her work on the page.
Right. So let's a real short question about structure. Both of your books are not completely linear. Ginger, you kind of move back and forth in time while the linear story is going on. And James, your book actually breaks up by moving into second person.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder about the decisions you made about that and how that were, how you made those decisions.
I'll take it first. Yeah, second person came unexpectedly to me. And I wrote a short essay for brevity that anybody who wants to read a little bit more about this online. I sort of distilled my thoughts of how I connected the way I saw myself from the outside in. And it's in 3 chapters where, and I realized, naturally, I just dived into second person, the you instead of I, in these 3 chapters. And I think I knew instinctively why I was using that point of view while I was writing, but it was, in the revision where it really fully coalesced in my mind that I was doing this because these were the times I felt least centered. I felt the least sense of self. I felt most unmoored from who I understood myself to be. And they're not, the first 3 chapters. One of them is early, one of them is in the middle, and one of them is very late. And it's, it shows the evolution of how, we don't understand who we are always. It's not a linear process of self-awareness and understanding who we are.
That's great. That's a great answer for use of the second. Because I think you have to remove, you can't, you're not able to stay right in the I, because whatever that topic is. And I thought it was brilliant, that first chapter surprised me, and I love being surprised. And then and because it was like this removed, and I was like, wow, that's brave to do that at the beginning of a memoir, because you're told all the time, grab your reader, at that first chapter, that first part of your first chapter. And you grabbed me by making that choice. So that was really interesting.
I will say, yeah, when you said it's sort of a way of protecting yourself, the second person, something else that didn't occur to me until it was one of my adult students who is a practicing clinical psychologist recently told me that to her it was a very clear manifestation of the Freudian ego, and that part of our psychology that instinctively tries to protect ourselves. And I was like, yeah, it really is that you, as we're sort of viewing ourselves from the outside in and constructing. I was a psych major, but maybe not a very good one, but because none of that triggered in my mind as the connection I was trying to make. But I think there's maybe something to that, is the you allowed me to step outside myself in those 3 chapters. And it was almost like it sounds really trite to say this, but it was the story was very much writing itself, not literally, of course, but my voice felt most natural in weirdly in those second person chapters.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah.
And Ginger, chronology for you and how you came to the structure of your book?
Very much naturally. What came, how I put it together came in the revision, but like whatever, nothing was written in order. Lots of, yeah. And then I just made it all come together in revision, because I just can't do outline-y stuff. I don't do that kind of writing. In terms of going back, into the present and then going back, that's all an emotional journey when I'm writing. I'll be writing about some scene that's happening in front of me with the horses and the residents, and all of a sudden it really triggered some of that whole scene. The basketball scene got triggered during the middle of me writing another one of the stories in the book. And so I was like, I would just write a little note like basketball, Margie, and then the next day launch off onto that. So the writing itself sort of triggers my emotional memories, and then I make notes and be prepared. Like I always say to my friends and people who I'm like, if I'm writing and, just leave me alone, because I'm in the middle of something that's really hard and I'm probably going to be crying, but don't worry about me. That's how it works for me. And then I'll look at I just love how like different shapes put chapters next to each other. And for me, I did have to keep the honest year and a half trajectory of what really happened. But how I got there was really actually through workshopping too. I stayed really working, going to workshops and really just trying to keep things keep coming. Because I finished my MFA about halfway through the book, and I didn't have that juice that you kind of have when you're studying. And so I just kept workshopping and going places, and it just kept coming. I didn't want the flow to stop,
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you mentioned that basketball section, because that's one of my very favorite lines from Half Broke, and something that really resonated with me. And I think both our memoirs, to a certain extent, deal with hiding parts of our identity, and that was where you mentioned first sort of coming to terms with your sexuality. And there's this line that I bookmarked here. I slipped between the cracks of what people were supposed to be and hid there.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think will resonate with whatever people's experiences are. There's parts of us that we present to the world and parts of us that we keep tucked away. And a lot of the times we keep those parts tucked away because we don't even understand them yet ourselves.
Yeah.
So writing a memoir is obviously all about vulnerability and the degree to which you are willing to make yourself vulnerable in the writing of the book. I'm wondering if there's any place that either of you vowed you weren't going to go to writing your book that you ended up at anyway.
Oh yeah, for me, I was not going to be put in the book. Not at all. My story's not that interesting. These people are way more interesting than me.
Uh-huh.
you know, I just was like not going to be in the book, and that's where everybody just pushed and pushed and pushed on me. You know, everybody did, and so I just kept plumbing, you know. But no, I put myself in, and I would put these little like 2-liners in, and then leave it, and then I'd have to go plumb it, you know, because somebody would put a red line around it.
I think that resulted in a lot of really compelling narrative suspense, is because you're not in it in the first movement, but we get an allusion to who you are, and that there's something beneath the surface that we're going to get, that we're gonna acknowledge soon. And it's almost like a film technique of Spielberg not showing us the shark for X number of hours of the movie, but we know it's coming.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of those places where your reluctance in the early on, because of course we do eventually get that full honesty.
I had
I'm
to.
impressed you've been able to work in not one, but 2 Jaws references.
No
I
surprise. No surprise.
I didn't even catch the first.
Was there a place you vowed to yourself you weren't going to go, James?
Oh, I wonder. Once I decided that I was writing this memoir, I already felt naked. I was like, here's, this is who I am. I can't see. And there were, it was new layers of discomfort with every chapter. Ginger's mentioned crying while writing. That was a new one for me. I had never cried while writing before. I wonder if anybody remembers me in Coffeeology on Tate Street, dabbing my eyes one morning in between refills of coffee. But I wouldn't say there was anything I vowed was off limits, but there was definitely surprise with each layer. I was like, all right, we're going here, aren't we? Okay, I guess we need to.
So, Ginger, I'm wondering if you, because you've been out talking about your book for a while, have any advice for James, who's about to do
Please.
And how it feels to go out and talk to people about these things that are very, very personal and very emotional.
Yeah, I'd say it's going to be really different than your novel, what you're going to find out there. And people are going to be really, really moved, and really, they feel very like you've helped them, and you become a little bit of a piece of hope. It's not like fiction, they're not going to be like, I loved your character, and can you write they're gonna ask you lots of personal questions, and you're gonna be happy. I was happy to go there, but it's a really different thing where memoir does really give readers someplace to go inside themselves, and of course they reinterpret your scenes that totally wrong.
Yeah.
But you just go with it because that's what it meant to them,
Yeah.
and it's so fascinating to see what moves people. But basically you've moved people in a different way, and memoirs. And so when you go out on a book tour, it's a totally different experience than doing fiction. It's, I hate to say it, but it's a little like self-help. It's a self-help book tour. So, on some level, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm still doing quite a bit for the book, and there's an organization called Old Lesbians for Change, and I realized somewhere I became one of them. I'm an old lesbian for change, and I just did a reading with them, and oh my God, there was like 35 women in their 70s, 80s, and how much it moved them, my book. And it felt like a self-help group at some level there. But so when you're in the memoir, any of that stuff's going to start happening, especially I know for you with people with disabilities, it's just going to flood.
Yeah, I hope so. I've sort of steeled myself or walled off the possibility of, and it's one thing if somebody doesn't like the book when you've written a novel. You're like, well, you don't like murder mysteries, you don't like academic satires, you didn't like the plot, you didn't like XYZ. But if somebody doesn't like the memoir, even if it's just a craft thing, you're like, oh, I'm sorry you hate me. That's terrible. This is me. This is the truest form of me. But so far with all the writing, the pieces that I publish online about losing my sight and navigating the world in that way, it's been, I think a big part of that, after I published an essay in 2016 that got such a great response, that was sort of what gave me the courage to and not just the courage, but the belief that this was a story that could become a full-length memoir. But the response from people to those essays that I've written has just been so much deeper than anything people have responded to in terms of fiction I've published. And I do think it's the difference between people. Weirdly, people see themselves in memoir, no matter how specific and different your story is from their own. It's really true that there's something universal in the specific.
So what's next? What are you writing next?
I am working on a book that starts out with nonfiction and heads into fiction, and it's similar themes because these are the things that I love in my life. I started a farm project near my house where I was supposed to be working with 10 men who were in long-term recovery, and we were going to be starting this farm. And but at the time they didn't have the 10 men that were far enough in their recovery. They had 6 women, and so I started with the 6 women. And about the time that they got the 10 men together, they kicked the 6 women out. And so the book kind of starts with me working with the women, this whole scenario. And then when they kicked the women out, I had no power. But I had this question: what would I do if I could do something for them? And that's what my book is about, is what happens after they get kicked out and what we do together. And that's all fiction. So,
is it connected to the same ranch?
It's a different ranch.
Okay.
Yeah. But some of my people come back in my fiction. So
good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I would like to hear more about some of your people. James, what about you?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear, Ginger, that you sort of blur the line between fiction and nonfiction, or at least straddle those genres. It gives me faith that there is hope for the genre genre promiscuous among us. I'm in the, I think, editing stages of a new novel it's a speculative novel, kind of weird, hopefully good weird. It's set in the malls of the 80s and 90s, about child stars, some real, some fictional, and a young boy who's been separated from his mother. I do not know any more details about when it might reach you. It's a novel, and the publishing world moves slowly. So coming to your bookshelves in 2027.
I should recommend James's Twitter feed. If you are on Twitter and you want, 80s and 90s cultural references to things today, and clever little writing quips about the publishing industry, James's Twitter feed is the place to find that. It's always fun to, I don't know how you do these things. I don't know how you post on Twitter. I don't know how people do those things.
I just hope that the memoir can bring new readers to my tweets.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point, right? Just to move people toward your Twitter feed. So any other memoirs that you really love that you would like to recommend to the folks out there? that they
Oh,
might not have
gosh.
heard of?
I
Gosh,
don't,
there's so many.
I have no idea what I've heard of that other people haven't heard of, but I'll say the three that first roll off my tongue because I've been thinking about them ever since I've read them in the last few years. But Emma Copley Eisenberg's The Third Rainbow Girl, which is a hybrid memoir and true crime book that came out early 2020, which is about a late 1970s or early 1980s murder at a rainbow gathering in West Virginia.
Oh, wow.
And she gets so much right about West Virginia, which is where I'm from, and which is a state that is so often written about in the wrong way from people who have not been there. And Emma is so good in writing about herself and her own identity. And the other that is sort of a similar book is Alex Marzano-Lesnevich's The Fact of a Body, which is also a true crime hybrid memoir where the author sort of uncovers her own trans identity as she's an attorney working in this. It's been years. I would get the facts wrong of the case, but there's a case that she is working on as an attorney. And the other one I'll throw out, since Ginger mentioned Pam Houston, one of my favorites the last couple of years is Deep Creek, which is just gorgeous nature writing. But she's writing about herself as well through the writing about the land.
Great.
Yeah, I was going to mention Pam's book too, Deep Creek, Hope in the High Country. I read, I got an advanced copy of Melissa Febos's new nonfiction work coming out. It's called Girls.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing, Melissa Febos, and it's, it has to do with her, but she's a researcher and an amazing writer that braids so many emotional as well as factual things in. She's just a smart, emotional writer. That's coming out, I think now. I think it might be out in March or April.
It's out now.
It's out now.
Yeah.
And then a book that a lot of people didn't read, but I mean, a lot of people love, was The Long Lost Tribe of Fatherless Girls. And anyhow, that T.K. Madden is the author. And also that's another one that has some issues around gender and sexuality. A really brilliant memoir.
Okay.
And I should correct, Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, I should have said they and their instead of the other pronouns.
One last thing to comment on. I think a lot of people who are just starting out writing or who want to write sort of are taught by popular culture not to value, to believe that writing is this isolated thing that you do all by yourself and then you just present to the world, right? Your genius is presented to the world, and there's not really an understanding of writing community in a lot of people's conception of how people write. And one of the things I heard both of you talk about today is how much the writing community helped you in your process. And I wonder if you could just talk about that just a little more as kind of a place to end.
Okay, I can start. Being that, being a student of writing is what I consider myself, not a teacher of writing, I had no idea how much of a community it was going to take to actually write a book. And so I walked through it. I wasn't even hoping to write a book when I went to my MFA program, but that was part of the deal. When you go to an MFA program, they make you write a book, half a book anyhow. So it was that community at the Institute of American Indian Arts that totally pushed me forward, a community of writers that were just real and no ego, and nobody was trying to outdo anybody. It was super supportive. It was everything I was heard that MFA programs were not. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and I think they're what you want them to be and what you need them to be. And if you show up in an MFA program and you're not interested in the politics and being the best, but you're just there to get everything you can, then you'll get what you need. And but you hear so many bad things, I did anyhow, about MFA programs and the competition, between students. And so it doesn't have to be that way. And the same thing with writing workshops. I actually think writing workshops are even better than the MFA program, because you just get a lot more attention, a lot more detail. So I've been workshopping and continue to workshop. I take stuff, I go through Writing by Writers, Pam Houston's organization, and she has craft stuff going on, her organization all the time. So I'm online all the time in groups with people as a student still working on my writings. And everybody always says to me, how can you take the criticism? How do you do the critique? Well, maybe because I was older and I've already been critiqued in my life a lot, that I was able to take it better. But I think you just hang on to what you know is yours, and you open yourself up to getting better, but you don't abandon yourself. And maybe I just didn't find that all that hard, so being in community means you are going to be sharing and being critiqued. But that just makes the community even deeper, if you can trust a few people in your community of writers to do that for you and with you, and you do that for them.
Mhm.
Anyhow, I just think it takes a freaking village for a book. I mean, I can't tell you how many people it takes. And then you have everybody at Norton was amazing. My agent is amazing, and how she took my book and sent it to like 10 people at the University of Washington in Seattle who were in a master's program there. And then I got 10 copies of my book back from 10 people I didn't know.
Wow.
And then I did a workshop, a book length workshop with 6 other people. So I got 6 copies of, so, I mean, I was inundated with help and advice and really good readers. That's how a book gets made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it comes down to trust, surrounding yourself with people whom you trust are working from a place of good faith, who are trying to help you. And I think that's one of the things you learn over the years is who is inherently trying to help you tell the story you're trying to tell. Sometimes, people think, well, feedback and critiques, they're just people trying to tear you down. And I'm sure there are a lot of people like that. And sometimes it becomes easy to recognize when somebody's reaction to your manuscript is more about them than the manuscript that they're critiquing. But more often than not, and certainly the older you get, the easier it becomes to spot those friends. And I will say that one of the things that's, speaking of Twitter, one of the things that's flattened the earth and broadened what literary community means and how we find it is the online world of social media and sharing work. And the majority of my first readers now are people that I've met online by being fans of their work, or people whose work I have published as a fiction editor, or people who have reached out to me on Twitter because they like something I've read. And we become each other's readers, and it's just remarkable at how small the world has become in a good way.
Yeah. I think it's really different for a professional like James, who's in the writing world, and a teacher. It's really different, like the way you build community, because you're inside that community already, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are those people who aren't in that side of that community, which I am, and I'm okay with. I like being not in that community. That's where I see so many writers get stuck. Like, where do I go? How do I get help?
Yeah.
They don't know that there are these communities out there. And then when they, so that's what I want to say to all those who are writing that aren't in the middle of a community. We are out here. All of us are out here. It's online mostly now, but once it breaks open again, I would really keep going to writers' workshops. I mean, they're the most amazing places to be, in my opinion, because you get around a whole bunch of people working on writing and with their heart on their sleeve, and it's amazing to be in that environment.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. We want to say that Ginger Gaffney's Half Broke is available now in paperback. And
I just got a
there
copy
she
of
is.
it.
There
Yeah.
it is.
I never wanted to be on the cover.
You never wanted to be in the book. And James Tate Hill's Blind Man's Bluff is available August 3rd, but you can pre-order it now, anywhere you want to pre-order it. And everyone would love you if you pre-ordered the book. Thank you both so much for being here and for talking and for just sharing your stories with us. They are both really beautiful books. I really enjoyed them. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Ginger. This was amazing and so much more than I hoped it would even be.
Yeah, thanks for all the great questions and thoughts, Steve. They were really wonderful.
Absolutely.
It helps to have great books to springboard.
Thank you again for joining us for 21 Conversations. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like and share with your friends and fellow readers. One final reminder that Greensboro Bound is a nonprofit organization committed to bringing together readers and writers throughout the year at zero cost to our community. Please help Greensboro Bound maintain that commitment with a sustaining or one-time gift now. The number to text to give and our website are on your screen. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in person next year.